Dr. Julian Siegel, who is a leading psychologist, psychiatrist in the country, has spent a great deal of time with people who have gone through extended periods of significant trauma in their life. He worked with the Iran hostages back in the 70s during Carter's thing, and he worked extensively with many POWs through the Vietnam era, through their all the experiences those guys went through. And he has spent considerable time with people who've had very, very intense, maybe a little shorter periods of trauma, but intense, like the people who've gone through Virginia Tech shootings or Las Vegas shootings, or now this week with what has happened in Florida. And he wrote a book entitled Winning Life's Toughest Battles. And in the first chapter, he speaks about a fellow by the name of Vice Admiral John Stockdale, who was 2,714 days in prison in Hanoi, in northern Vietnam. And he was in a very, very dark dungeon-type cell most of those days. And there was a period of time where they dragged him out of his cell, his dark cell, and they nailed him to the ground, not a tree or anything like that. It was in an open ground where there was no shade at any time during the day. And southern Asia being what it is, with a baking hot sun, going from extreme dark to extreme light, it blinded him for quite some time. And the heat of the sun drained him from his strength. And yet, even though he was weary and tired, they would not allow him any sleep. And they beat him on a regular basis. During one of the most severe beatings, where he was taking the most significant hits, he all of a sudden hears the snapping sound of a towel. Have you ever, tried to snap somebody with a towel and put a stinger on him, or her? And the sound that towel makes? Well, all of a sudden he heard several snaps of the towel, and he realized that somebody inside the cells was communicating to him in a code that only the prisoners had known. They kind of worked it out through all those long days. They had figured out a code that the guards didn't know. And he listened to the snapping while he was taking his hits. And in that snapping came several letters: G, B, U, J, S. G, B, U, J, S. He said it was the most significant message he had ever received in his life, giving the timing of it. God bless you, John Stockdale. Somebody who was experiencing his pain, someone who was in his hell, was reaching out in relationship to communicate encouragement while he was taking his hits. And through that whole chapter that Julian wrote, he described how those POWs fought for every moment of relationship. They even learned how to communicate through the sound that a broom makes while they were sweeping out their sails. The sound of the sweep was actually could be a coded message, or sometimes pounding on the ceiling or the floor or the bars or maybe the pipes with their sandals. One guy, they could actually understand the code when somebody was shaking his blanket and getting the dust off his blanket, and how he shook the blanket was communicating code of encouragement. They even said they learned how to communicate through their belching, through the blowing of their nose, and passing gas. How'd you like to receive a message out of passing gas? I bet you when you're in that hell, you'll take the encouragement however you can get it. Amen? One old boy would fake sleep every night for the first hour. Fake sleep, and he would snore deliberately. And how he snored was communicating to the other guards. And a POW, Everett Alazar, in the book, was quoted as saying that they all knew their names, the names of their kids, their wives, where they were from, how long they'd been in prison, their aspirations, hopes, and dreams for the future. And Julian said that the ones who stayed in communication, the ones who stayed in relationship, had a 10 times better chance of surviving that hell than the ones who suffered alone. Those men were fighting for every second of relationship. That's how important it is. And that's what we're talking about during this series. And I have a deep-seated conviction that we have forgotten how to fight for relationship. We quit too soon. We give up too easily. Dare to repair, restore, not replace broken relationships. At work, at home, in marriages, and even here in church. And that's what's going on in this passage that we started to look at last week in Hosea 1, 2, and 3. God is desperately fighting to restore a broken relationship with Israel, who have slid in once again into some serious idolatry, worshiping other gods, fake gods, dead gods, instead of the one true living God. He could have replaced them, but out of his love for them, he keeps fighting, not giving up. Are we giving up too easily on our relationships? Last week, we saw in verses 1 through 5 of Hosea chapter 2 that God was willing to confront, and this is when you're sick. What is sick, he calls sick. This is when you're sick. This is why you're sick. This is who you are in your sickness. This is where I'm at. This is my position in your sickness. This is how I feel about it. This is what you've done to others in your sickness. And this is how you got sick in the first place. Now, as we move into verses 6, 7, and 8, that whole section, those 3 verses, starts with one dynamic, connecting word. In verse 6, it says, therefore. And you know the old law. When you see the word therefore, you see what it's there for. And it's always introducing the literary law of cause and effect. And in this case, the cause is the sickness that God is confronting them with in verses 1 through 5. You're sick. You're sick. Therefore, verses 6, 7, and 8, this is what's going to happen. This is what I'm prepared to do in your sickness. And since we are called to emulate him, how he deals with our sick relationships can give us a window in how we deal with our own broken relationships. And I want you to see 6 things that God is doing here and in his effort to restore instead of replace. He goes to them and he basically says in verse 6, I am going to bring an end to your destruction. You are continually messing things up and bringing in disruption and dismantling and damaging broken relationships. So this is what I'm going to do. And in the first phrase of verse 6, it says, I am going to put in your path these thorn bushes. Do you see it there? I'm going to put these thorn bushes in your path because I'm not letting you go down this road anymore. I'm stopping it here. The more you go down this road and destroy relationships, the more it's going to hurt you. Because just like what we talked about last week, sickness in relationships and the sin that causes the sickness spreads. Remember that? I threw out some general statistics about first, second, third, and fourth marriages. I actually refined that a little bit and studied it a little bit. First, actually, for the last 50 years, divorce rate's 50% in our culture, 50%. In the second marriage, it's 67%. In the third marriage, it's 87%. And in the fourth marriage, the chances of that marriage, it's only 3%. Divorce rate is 97%. Now, you would think the longer we do something, the better we get at it. But it's just the opposite. Do you know why? Because you're not getting to the source of the problem. See? That's what he's basically saying by putting these thorns in our way, in our path, so we can't go any further. He's attacking the source of the problem. And it's not just in marriages, it's in our jobs, it's in our churches. I don't want to go down that road too far, but I will. I guess I will. Gen Xers, people who graduate from college between 85 and 92. By the time they're 10 years into their career, they've already quit on 2 jobs, on average. Millennials, first 10 years into the career, they've given up on 4 jobs already. That's the average. And it's all under the banner of, well, you know, I'm a mover and shaker, and I'm willing to dump this job to go get better money or get this promotion. And I get that, and it's all celebrated. They all celebrate it. But it's at the cost of something. And one of those things is relationship. Where we're valuing the upward mobility and the money more than this. The average church loses 14% of its congregation every year. Do you know what that means? 1 out of 7 will leave. And in 7 years, the church has a totally new congregation. Because they don't know how to sustain relationship. 17% of a church's congregation doesn't settle on one church. They have 5 or 6 churches and they rotate. So they don't have to get too intimate with any one church or too involved in any one church. They just go around and around. That's 1 out of 6. Did you hear about the lady? I don't even know. I think I'm probably way off my thing here, but I'll pay the price for it later on. But one lady went to her pastor, and I want you to know I'd never say this. I'd never say this because your pastor's so spiritual, so Christ-like, you know. But she went to him. She was already on her 7th church in 5 years. And she went to him with the classic line. Every pastor's heard this. The greatest preachers in the country, I tell you, have heard this. We've all heard it. Well, I'm just not being fed anymore. Just not being fed anymore, which covers a multitude of sins. And it's time to leave. And she caught him in a weak moment. I want you to know I would never say this, okay? But he was caught in a weak moment. And I'm going to read it because I don't want to mess it up. But he turns to this lady. Her name's Ethel. And he says in this weak moment, he says, "That's all right, Ethel. It doesn't really matter what the label is on the outside when the bottle's empty on the inside." Now, you have a pastor never say that. I might think it, but I'd never say it. How many times in our own, through the years, as a family, how many times have we celebrated somebody who got a good report about cancer? You know, maybe some surgery worked and they said, well, we got it all, you're cancer free, or maybe the radiation, the chemo worked, and they get this bill of health from some doctor says, oh, you're cancer free, you're cured, and we all, yay. About 6 months later, they find out they're eat up with cancer and got a month to live. How many times have we done that, guys? How many times have we been around that barn? Because they didn't find the feeder. They didn't find the source of that cancer. They thought they had, but they were only dealing with the results, the outer edges of the cancer. They never found the mother lode of that cancer. They never got to the real source. When God puts these thorns in our way, and He's saying, I'm not letting you go down this road anymore. He's dealing with the very source, the core of our problem. Are you with me? I'm going to stop this destruction because I've had it. They're not going down this road anymore. You go any more down this road, it's going to hurt. We all right? Then another effect of this sin is that God will bring an end to our dissension. Look at the second phrase of verse 6, where He says, I will wall Israel up. I'm going to wall her up so that she cannot find her way. Not only is He blocking their way of going any further in this direction, but He's going to block their influence by isolating them so that their sickness can't spread. Remember when Paul, before he got converted, was this tenacious guy that was going after persecuting the church? His name was Saul back then, and he even murdered some Christians. He was that tenacious. And then God saves him in this powerful conversion on the road. That's just going to Damascus. Knocks him off the back of his horse, converts him, and he's got these scales, and they fall off at Cornelius' house. It's just a phenomenal conversion. And he gets the tenacity that he had in persecuting the church. The tenacity is still there to spread the gospel. And he starts teaching like crazy. And he starts teaching in the synagogues until there's so many people get converted and convinced about Christ that the rabbis get threatened, they throw him out. So he starts preaching in the streets, and he gets so many Gentiles converted that the leaders of Damascus get worried, and they start plotting to kill him. And so the church has to sneak him out at night to save his life. And so they take him to Jerusalem. Well, the big boys down in Jerusalem, they don't want to have anything to do with him because they've heard about this guy. And they think he's faking. And big old Barnabas steps in, takes him under his wing, says, boys, we need to listen to this guy because God is doing great things. And he mentors him, and they say, okay, we'll keep him around. And then he does the same thing in Jerusalem that he did in Damascus. He started going after what they call Hellenistic Jews, Jews that were culturally mixed with Greek culture. And he starts seeing many of these Hellenistic Jews converted until their rabbis get threatened, and they throw him out of the synagogue. And then he starts preaching in the streets, and Gentiles coming to Christ right and left. And they start plotting to kill him again. So the leaders of the church say, we ought to probably do something about this. And so they commissioned Barnabas to take Paul to a place called Tarsus. Do you know how far away Tarsus is? It's over 500 miles. It's not even on the map. You turn to some of your maps in the back, you won't even find it on the map because it's about 2 or 3 countries north of where Jerusalem is. And I want you to read something in Scripture. It's in Acts chapter 9, verse 31. After they move him out, they move him up to this town out in the boondocks. Listen to verse 31 of Acts chapter 9. Then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, Samaria, the whole 9 yards, not just Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, Samaria, the whole 9 yards, enjoyed a time of peace. Why? Because we had just sent off the tornado. Even Paul needed some time of isolation. Have you ever been on a team where the chemistry wasn't good? Or on the job where the chemistry, the culture was toxic? Even sometimes in church, just seems like something's not quite right. And then somebody gets moved. They get transferred or something. Maybe they have to go off the team, and even though they're the best scorer on the team, and everybody says, "Oh man, now we're going down. We just lost our best scorer on the team." Or at work, "Oh man, that guy knew where everything was." Or at church, "Oh, that was one of the most involved people we had, one of our best tithers. Now we're going down." And when that person is removed, all of a sudden, the toxic climate goes away. And everybody's looking around and saying, it sure does feel a little better around here. Have you ever gone through something like that? Boy, things are working a little more smoothly around here. In Titus, chapter 3, verse 10, it says, "As for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice," because grace always plays a part, then it says, "have nothing to do with him." God will bring an end to our dissension. He'll bring up the walls and isolate our influence. Make sure you're not that guy. Make sure you're not that gal. We all right? Number 3, God will bring an end to our dysfunction. Look at the first sentence of verse 7. God will bring an end to our dysfunction. She will chase after her lovers, but not what? Not catch them. She will look for them, but not what? You know what I think God is dealing with there in that phrase? I think He's dealing with Israel's addiction. Because I think Israel's addicted. Sometimes when Satan comes along and he tempts us, and we fall for that temptation, and sometimes we dab at it, sometimes we swallow it whole, right? I mean, we just fall all the way. And every now and then, you know what can happen when we give into that kind of temptation to that degree? We swallow it that hard. You know what can happen? Then the temptation swallows us. And at that point, owns us. It's like that snail, I wish I could have remembered the name of it, that jellyfish love to eat because it's really bright and colorful, and the jellyfish see it and they devour it, but its shell protects them from the enzymes, and it's not digested. And you know what happens? The jellyfish eats the snail, and then the snail gets on the inside and begins to eat the jellyfish. That's what addiction is like. And I think that's what's happening with Israel. It started way back with that golden calf when they came out of Egypt and they made this idol. That is Israel's addiction. And they wanted to worship this idol. God is not God. This idol is God. And then Moses came and scolded them for it. And then Achan comes and he covets this stuff that was in Jericho, and he steals this beautiful purple coat from Babylon and some silver and some gold. And it causes them to lose the next battle in a small town of Ai. And they have to discipline him for it. And then some of the countries, some of the nations where they're starting to they're overflowing them, they're overtaking them so they can get to the promised land. They start adopting and adapting to some of their gods, like Baal, which was a god of Canaan, of the Canaanites. And it just seems to grow and grow and grow. It's like they're addicted. They can't let it go. It's not so much that they have it, it's that it has them. There are some that are addicted to some of the sin that it has you. You don't have it, it has you. And every now and then for the Israelites, some king, some godly king would come along, and he would cause revival, and he would try to get rid of all the Asherah poles and all the high places where they built altars to these foreign gods. And he would get rid of them, and there'd be this little revival for as long as the king lived. And then when the king died, they went back to their vomit like a dog. Like a dog. Next thing you know, they're right in the thick of their idolatry all over again. And that goes for 724 years. Until you know what cures them? You know what cures them? God taking His hand off and letting another country come in and invade them and carrying them off into exile to Babylon. And they're in exile for 70 years. That's what cured them. How far is God going to have to go with us before we give up our addictions, the things that we place before Him? The things that cause our relationships to get sick. Are you with me this morning? Good preaching, John. Good preaching. Oh, just feel it. Number 3. God will, no, did I already do that? Number 4, right? Am I on number 4? God will bring an end to our disposition. God will bring an end to our disposition. Now, all of a sudden, this is weird. All of a sudden, we get to the next sentence in verse 7, and there's a light. All of a sudden, there's a light in all this. Listen to this. In verse 7, Israel says, "Then she will say, I will go back to my husband as at first, for then I was better off than now." That's the first hint that after God has confronted them with their destruction and their dissension and their dysfunction, all of a sudden there's this change of heart. God can even change our taste buds. Isn't that something? God can even begin to break our addictions. You know who it sounds like? Somebody in the New Testament, when she says, "I will go back to my husband," does that remind you of somebody in the New Testament that discovered the seriousness of their condition, and they said almost the same words? "I'm going to go back to my father," the prodigal son. All of a sudden, they begin to see the truth of their circumstances. You know, I think my servants eat better. I'm eating like a pig, and I think my father's servants eat a little bit better than that. I think I'm going to go home. I'm going to go back to my husband. I'm going to go back to my father. Guys, everybody has to learn how to love the right things. Listen to me. The whole Christian life, the whole thing, is an acquired taste. It goes against the nature because you were created in sin. We are sinful people. It goes against the grain. The whole thing about this holiness, this righteousness, this integrity, living generously, selflessly, it's all an acquired taste. You know, I used to hate vegetables. I hated lima green beans, asparagus. Oh, God, give me a break. I learned to like them because that's what Kath fixed. Because I loved Kath, I'm going to learn to like these crazy vegetables. Now I love them. Isn't it weird? The things that you have to learn to love when you're older, that's the best stuff. This whole thing of healing broken relationships, not giving up on them, restoring them instead of replacing them, it all goes against the grain. You got to learn to love it. But we have a God that can change our taste buds. Amen? Am I ready for number 5? God will bring an end to our distortion. God will bring an end to the lies that we believe. God will bring an end to our distortion. Here's the thing. Let's look at verse 8. All of a sudden, the hope that we see in verse 7 gets slammed in our faces. We think, hey man, she's going back to her husband. Things are going to be cool. But then we come to verse 8 and it says, the Lord says of Israel, she has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, the oil, who lavished, I love that word, who lavished on her the silver and the gold. You know what the big difference is between Israel, who sees the truth of her circumstances and wants to go back to her husband, and the prodigal son, who sees the truth of his circumstances and wants to go back to his father? Do you know what the big difference is? They both see the truth of their circumstances, both want to go back. But there's something the prodigal sees that Israel hasn't seen. There's a deeper truth that goes beyond their circumstances. And you know what it is? The prodigal sees who his daddy is. Israel doesn't have a clue. You know, guys, can I be frank and honest? It's no big deal to see the truth of your circumstances when you're more hungry than the pigs. That's not a big deal. You know, when you're hurting and you've hit some of those thorns and the circumstances are not good, it's not that hard to see the truth of where you are. But you know what's a little deeper truth that sometimes we don't see? Is who your dad is. These Israelites are where they are because they forgot who their dad was. This prodigal is where he is because he forgot who his dad was. But in the circumstances that he's facing, all of a sudden the light comes on and he sees his dad for who he is, his source. There is nothing in his life that his father has not given him. These Israelites do not have a clue. There are some Christians in this room. There are some people, maybe I shouldn't even use the label. There are some people in this room who can see the truth of where you are, the pain, the hurt, and you don't like where you are. But you have yet to acknowledge who your dad is. And here's the hitch. You can't improve your circumstances until you figure that out. Who's your dad going to be? Who is he to you? Until you figure that, you cannot improve this. You cannot heal broken relationships among us until you heal the broken relationship that's up there. And you can't heal that broken relationship until you know who he is. Good preaching. Oh, good preaching. Oh. Number 6. God will bring an end to our discrimination. God will bring an end. And this, I got to confess, I didn't see this until the very end. I worked on this till early morning. And I started this 3 months ago, and it just wasn't gelling. But I came to this last phrase in verse 8. You see this last phrase? It says, which they used for Baal. Do you see that? I'm going to read the whole verse again. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. And in the Amplified Version, which digs out every possible interpretation of the Hebrew, it goes on to say, which they used for Baal and made into Baal's image. You know what's going on? They're taking what God has lavished upon them. And they're taking what their father has given them and they're forming it into a false god. And they're worshiping it in place of their father. You talk about a slam. The prodigal sees that. Israel doesn't. The prodigal not only sees his circumstances, not only sees who his father is, but he sees who he is. He sees his sickness. The very first thing he says when he starts coming to his senses is, I have sinned. In fact, he goes to his father. First thing he says, I have sinned. I know who I am. I know what I've done. I know what I've worshiped and what I replaced you with. I know that I'm sick. Guys, how many times have we taken what God has lavished upon us and laid it at the altar of some false god in our life? Come on. Are you with me? You know who else blew it big time? And not only saw his circumstances, but he saw who his father was, and in that saw who he was. Remember in the Old Testament, remember David? Remember him? Starts off as a shepherd boy, and God makes him a king. And wins many battles, saves him from the hands of Saul. And then he sees this woman bathing. And all of a sudden, there's something in his heart he loves more than God. And wants more than God. Should have been out there battling with his men, but he stayed back. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time, saw something he should have never seen, and all of a sudden there's something more dear to him than his own relationship with his father. And he covets it, he impregnates her, and then he has her husband murdered. Does it get any worse than that? And God sends Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and confronts David with his sin. And in verse 13, you know the very first words out of David's mouth? I have sinned. I know who I am. And I know what I've done. I've taken what God has lavished on me, and I have worshipped a false god with it. I'm not very good at memory. I have to work very hard. But every now and then I'll run across a verse or a chapter that hits me so hard that even I will try to commit it to memory. The older I get, the harder it is. When I came across Psalm 51, and I read those words that David wrote not long after he committed this terrible sin, not long after Nathan confronted him, how he describes his sin. I don't know if I can do it. I can do it at home when no one's looking. I can do it when it's just you and me, but I'm not sure if I can do it in front of them. But it goes something like this. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassions, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin, for I know my iniquity. My sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so you were proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. Surely I have been a sinner from birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Surely you desire truth in the inner parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sin, and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will turn back to you. Save me from blood guilt, O God, the God who saves me, and my tongue shall sing of your righteousness. O Lord, touch my mouth, and my lips shall declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not rejoice in burnt offerings. The offering of the Lord is a broken heart, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. In your good pleasure, make Zion prosper, build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then there will be righteous sacrifices, whole burnt offerings to delight you. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. You not only have to see your circumstances, you not just have to see who your God is, you got to see your sin. And who your God is in light of that sin. Listen to this.
God of miracles, God